Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, we so appreciate you taking the time to listen, and we also appreciate those of you who have decided to support the show. You can go to jeffersonhour.com, click on donate, and we need it, and we so appreciate it. We get so much mail from folks who support the show and appreciate the show, so I'll quit gushing over that and say this week's program is a discussion primarily between you, Clay, and Joe Ellis, we start talking about conspiracy theories in America, and then we move it into gun rights in America and how those conspiracy theories sort of affect that.
You know, some conspiracy theories are worth exploration, but some, David, are so beyond any rational possibility that they strain our capacity to even understand where that can come from and how it can get proliferated by websites and by demagogues and so on. And yet they not only exist, but they're proliferating in our time. And so one of them, of course, goes back to the Founding Fathers and to the expertise of Joe Ellis. And that's, what did the Founding Fathers intend by the Second Amendment? Are we reading it accurately? Are we misreading it? And how should we interpret it today when a high-tech weapon is not a musket, but a 9mm handgun with extra magazines? And so these questions need to be discussed by a free and rational people. Getting that discussion started is almost impossible because people flare up into verbal and sometimes actual violence if you even touch upon a notion like that.
The conversation was hard on me this week because it wasn't real optimistic. But you and Joe both talked about the effect of the pandemic on the American population. But America is dropping in the world in its assessment of how free we are. There's an organization called Freedom House that has an annual assessment that shows how many of the world's population are living in a free country. America has dropped. I mean, we used to be up amongst countries like France and Germany, and now we're amongst small countries like Croatia and Mongolia, Panama and Romania. It's been a tough few years for America, and conspiracy theories lead us to that. I guess I'm rambling, but I hope you understand what I'm saying.
Yes, and I know you hate to say it because you have a largely optimistic outlook, but the fact is America is in decline. Yes, we're the richest people in the world, and we have some of the greatest tech in the world, and we have advantages over most other countries just from the size of America and the protection of the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean and the power of capital to make creative technology possible and to put the fruits of life into the hands of an ever wider percentage of people, not just here, but on Earth. And so there's so much that is measurably positive about America in the 21st century. And in a certain sense, we've never had it so good. But, you know, these groups like Freedom House look at the world and they find a system to measure quality of life. And even there, the United States has slipped. And, you know, I think I'm with Joe that I'm with Joe and Jefferson. It begins with education, that we're going to have to really do something about our educational system if we're going to train people to be critical thinkers, to be skeptical. And I want us to recover. And I think Jefferson is the answer. Of course, that's why I wrote my book, Repairing Jefferson's America. But I do think Jefferson is the answer, and that we need to cheer up, and we need to get out and garden, and we need to take long walks, and we need to have dinner parties, and we need to read more books, and so on. In other words, we're not a failed state. We are America. We have enormous resourcefulness. And the American people are on the whole extremely good and decent people, common sense people. And so there is a way out.
Can I summarize one thing from the program that I didn't during the program?
Yes, sir.
And that is Jefferson's position on guns. And we talked about that a bit, but Jefferson was a gun owner. He was a gun advocate. He encouraged their use by his nephews and friends, but he also advocated for their control. And I can give you the line. It's from his draft of the Virginia State Constitution, and he wrote, "No free man shall ever be debarred the use of arms within his own lands or tenements. So he said, yeah, you have the right to bear arms and own a gun, but there is a qualifier here. I take that to mean Jefferson recognized the need for regulation.
Well, he certainly realized that you have a right to have firearms in your home. The point that he's making there is that this is a self-defense mechanism. It's not taking your guns into the public square. And the technology, as I say in this week's Jefferson Watch, and by the way, I'm so glad to be back with an essay, and as I say in this one, that Jefferson understood that people have a right to weapons, but the technology has changed so not just profoundly, just to the point where it's an apples and oranges conversation between a musket on the Lewis and Clark expedition. The technology is just fundamentally different, and we need to factor that in. And none of what we said today, David, not one sentence that we said today suggests that we want to take guns away from anybody. It's a question of rational national restriction on future sales of weapons.
This sentence, I think, is real telling about Jefferson. And again, it came from his draft of the Virginia State Constitution. Somehow it did not make it into the final version. But you mentioned earlier in your statements repairing Jefferson's America. And I'm going to give you a chance once again. I know you're so excited because you pressed send and your newest book is off to the publisher and it's going to be available in May. You had said that we're probably going to have a Zoom town hall, sort of a book launch for that. And I know you've got classes coming up as well.
I got classes coming up. The book is finally done. I'm so glad that it's out of my hands. I sent the last corrections. So you write a book and then editors look at the book and then you shorten the book and then the copy editors look at a book and then they send you a proof and you fix the proof. But anyway, yes, there will be a book launch Zoom party. There will be more Jefferson Town meeting Zoom parties. We have some other things in mind that we've been talking about, and we are thrilled by the people who listen to the Jefferson Hour and contribute to its success. All I want in life at this point is just a bigger megaphone, is just to be able to reach more people. That and, of course, Dot's Pretzels. But let me just read one more sentence from the Jefferson Watch because it summarizes this week's program. And I say, look, my friends, at some point, we are going to have a rational national conversation about guns. I mean, think of that. How can that be a controversial sentence, David? At some point, we're going to have a rational national conversation.
Well, you know the kind of mail we get whenever we talk about guns on the Jefferson Hour, and somebody's going to find that statement controversial. But talking about mail, I have I'm holding in my hands 3 actual pieces of mail, real mail, letters written that I need to get to you. One from Nathan Hepner, one from Gene Wilmarth, and one from William Bryant, which is fairly critical about a program regarding our former president. And he lives in Williamsburg, and I'm going to send these to you today.
He's critical of our critique of President Trump?
He was dumbstruck when I listened to you and David discuss the January 6th storming of the Capitol. To quote Congressman Tim Ryan, "Are you kidding me? You suggested a committee could have been appointed to investigate the election. Tell me who the members are, and I will tell you the result."
There's a cynical human being.
It's a little bit, yeah, but you need to read it. And
I'm happy to read it, but I think we need a blue ribbon nonpartisan commission to look at the election and all of its irregularities. And I'm worried now that there are 300 and some new pieces of legislation working their way through the state legislatures that are going to create more chaos and confusion in our national election system. So there's a problem. And I don't think that this election was stolen. I think this election was fair, but I think that there is enough chaos in the way that we vote. Absenteeism, mail in, on the day, not the day. How long do you stand in line? Where are the voting booths? How many places can you drop a ballot? How are the ballots counted? How many paper ballots are there? What kind of machines? Who are the people who are sitting there? How are they monitored? How do we know that these companies that have the voting machines
Okay. All right. So let me give you some more of this letter.
We get it. This man is right. We need a national, nonpartisan, blue ribbon, scientifically based commission.
Yeah, but he says, tell me who the members are and I will tell you the result. He goes on, what would happen if a committee had found the election had been stolen? hold a special election. In no time, there would be riots in the street and our country would sink into anarchy. You and David did not think your discussion through. You were winging it, as you sometimes do, and it showed. Whoops. Your reference to Jefferson's letter about the blood of patriots and tyrants is just what right-wing zealots want to hear. You must know you're beating a dead horse. Jefferson has been exposed as a hypocrite long ago. Words are cheap, and of all the founders, his words never reflected his action. His belief in liberty extended only to the liberty to do whatever he wanted without interference. It's important to get these letters and know that there are people that really feel that way strongly. And I didn't intend to let the podcast intro go that long, but I'm going to send you this letter so you can respond to him if you wish.
Tell me again his name.
William Bryant.
Well, I can only say that we will, of course, take the letter seriously. I hope that he keeps listening, but I think it may be that he's just listening to the wrong program, because I think Jefferson, for all of his faults, is an extraordinarily important human being, and I take Jefferson very, very seriously. And I don't think that we, in any way, prevaricate or try to cover for Jefferson or to expose him unnecessarily, that he's a complex historical figure. And the whole point of this program is to use Jefferson's biography and his outlook and his writings and so on to explore fundamental issues of American life, and I'm proud of what we do. So,
well, in fairness, you should read his whole letter, and I will see to it, sir, that it gets to your hands. But it's important to hear from folks like he. When we get those kind of critical letters, we don't just put them in a drawer and forget them. I read them and take it all to heart.
Of course, and so do I. And I know no part of me wants to simply to dismiss a letter like that, and no part of me wants to be guilty of what he calls this, the talking without thinking, whatever he's talking about, winging it. I resent that, of course, but I understand, and I don't want to be accused of that. So that's only provocation for us to be more carefully modulated.
It was an interesting discussion. We again owe our great thanks to Joe Ellis. It's so much fun for me as the interlocutor, the semi-permanent guest host, to be able to sit back and listen to these two brilliant minds, yours and Joe's, exchange ideas. I really enjoy it, and I hope our listeners do too.
Well, I have the greatest time in my life. This is so much fun, and I appreciate all of our listeners. And so thank you. Let's listen to the program. We do take feedback. We thrive on it. I know that people who are listening will be upset by the presumption that there is an attack on guns. That is not my position, and it's not the position of this program.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and we are joined this week by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson, and also our favorite returning champion, our guest, Professor Joseph Ellis. Gentlemen, welcome to the both of you.
Hey ho.
Hey, thanks so much, David.
Always good to talk to you, the two of you, and particularly to listen to the two of you. Joan, you and I had a conversation a week or two ago, and you had suggested that we have a conversation about President Jefferson and guns. And I thought that would probably be a pretty interesting conversation. But before we start that, I must tell you that last week I spoke with President Jefferson. And
You did.
I did, as I often do, and your name was invoked on more than one occasion. We talked about trying to understand the British point of view prior to the Revolution and get Jefferson's take on that. And you and I had talked about that, and you made the comment that we Americans were sort of rooted in conspiracy theories. And it came from that time. Do you recall?
Yes. Conspiracy theories are alive and well in the United States as we speak. And in some sense, they've been part of the American story from the very beginning. And the first one is in the 1760s and 70s as Great Britain attempts to consolidate its new empire in the North American continent, all the land east of the Mississippi, south of Canada. The colonists developed the argument right away that there's a plot to enslave them. It's a very familiar, ringing assertion that a whole group of writers, to include Jefferson and Adams and John Dickinson and Patrick Henry, all used that. Now, in truth, the British didn't intend to make them slaves. They intended to make them colonists. That is to say, second-rate citizens in the British Empire. But the American position was, once we surrender the control of our fates to Parliament, there's no telling what they'll do. They could do anything. They're free to do anything, and that includes enslaving us. So this is a version of a conspiracy theory that I actually embrace as a fortunate one. Some of the ones alive and well now I do not, but I want to call attention to the fact that conspiracy theories are nothing new in American history.
Yeah, let me just say to that one of the things that is a glaring irony for me, and I'm sure for you too, Joe, at this point in the early mid-21st century is when you hear Washington or Jefferson or Patrick Henry or Madison or any of them saying that the British are enslaving us. It's just an appalling thing to remember that these people who are whining in this way were overtly enslaving black Africans, breeding them for profit, dividing their families, whipping them, sometimes killing them, raping them, and so on. And they had the gall to say they were being enslaved by somewhat onerous tax laws and regulations from Great Britain.
Well, I know, I hear what you're saying, and the great English writer, Samuel Johnson, wrote a pamphlet, 1775, called "Taxation, No Tyranny." And it was pretty much of a attack on the colonists. He said they were like a bunch of rattlesnakes, and he thought that all our houses should be burned down, so it was polemic. But there's one line in it that has lived on forever on the very point you're making, and that is, why is it, said Johnson, that the loudest yelps for freedom are always coming from the drivers of slaves? It's the central contradiction of the Revolution, and it will not be resolved until the Civil War. But and they were aware of it. I mean, that is to say, they were aware of the contradiction. It caused, and as the war proceeded, many of them, including Jefferson, began to realize that the contradiction at the center of the American Republic was something that needed to be resolved, lest it lead to something drastic like a civil war. They recognized that. And Washington is the only one of those men you named who actually freed his own slaves. He did so in his will. All the slaves he owned at Mount Vernon, which was about half of them. His wife officially owned the other half. Jefferson never did that, nor did Patrick Henry. Henry's remark on the whole contradiction is most honest, I think. Patrick Henry said, "I realize that what I'm doing as a slave owner contradicts everything I'm saying about liberty and freedom, and I wish I was different, but I cannot live without the slaves I own. And I just have to accept that I'm living a contradiction."
Joe, I'd like to begin this conversation by laying out a few of America's favorite conspiracy theories. And with your permission, I'd like to begin with World War II, the notion that somehow FDR was aware of Pearl Harbor or even encouraged it in order to get us into the war.
Yeah, it's a book called Backdoor to War, and that it was popular in the 50s and 60s. It's a total lie. That is to say, it's not true. It made some sort of plausible sense because, as you know, we didn't have to declare war on Germany because once we declared war on Japan, Hitler declared war on us because he had a treaty with Japan. So it did allow us to get into the war in Europe and as well as in the Pacific. But there have been multiple studies of it, and it's not true.
And here's a second one, Joe, that John F. Kennedy was not killed by a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, but by a conspiracy. That's a myth that does not go away from American history.
That still lives on in various places on the internet. I went to the building and the window from which the shot was fired, and when I was there, I suddenly realized it could have happened that way. That is, that one person had a pretty good shot from that window. I think it's difficult for us to imagine that a single non-entity can, by himself, kill a legendary figure like Kennedy. And it's just difficult for people to get their mind around that. I think this conspiracy theory hasn't been completely disproven in the minds of a lot of Americans.
All right, number 3, Martin Luther King was not assassinated by a lone white gunman, James Earl Ray, in April of 1968, but by a conspiracy of people who wanted this very effective black leader killed.
The killer confessed that he did it. He was caught right away. This is one of the more specious conspiracy theories.
The man who wrote the recent book about this, Hampton Sides, I read, and he said at the end of this book about the killing of Martin Luther King by James Earl Ray, he said that he's looked into it over years, interviewed absolutely everybody, read absolutely everything, looked at all the police files, the FBI files, and so on, and concluded a single gunman, and yet people shout him down in public about this.
I think this will always be the case in an American culture that's based on a popular opinion, which is vulnerable to all kinds of misinformation, and people, especially with the internet and the apps that now exist, where we're each getting our news from sources that support our own convictions and prejudices. But among the conspiracy theories you've mentioned, the one about Martin Luther King seems to me the wildest and most crazy.
And then this final one, on January 6, 2021, it wasn't a bunch of right-wing pro-Trump morons who sacked the U.S. Capitol. It was Antifa, and it was a false flag operation by leftists to try to discredit what otherwise would have been a peaceful protest against a stolen election.
This one is particularly worrisome to me because it undermines the legitimacy of the Biden election, and a significant number of Republicans apparently believe in this, or at least claim to believe in it. And I'm troubled because I want us to have a center-right party that's legitimate and robust, and I'm afraid the Republicans, by committing themselves to this outright lie, are committing suicide and making themselves essentially an undemocratic organization. That's my opinion, and I think the internet amplifies the capacity of conspiracy theories to live and to flourish. I'm a believer in the First Amendment, but I also think that we need some legislation that starts to to remove from the internet these kind of lunatics.
So I want to summarize for our listeners around the country and around the world that our returning champion, Dr. Joseph Ellis, now still at an undisclosed location somewhere in the Green Mountains of Vermont, has now taken on 4 conspiracy theories that World War II was touched off on purpose by FDR, and that he knew well in advance, and even encouraged the assault on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 6th, 1941, that JFK was not assassinated by a conspiracy, but by a lone gunman, almost certainly in November of 1963, that Martin Luther King was assassinated, according to you, by a lone gunman by the name of James Earl Ray. And by the way, that book by Hampton Sides is called Hellhound on His Trail, and it's a really, really interesting book. And finally, you are saying that the January 6, 2021 assault on the U.S. Capitol was, in fact, right-wing, Proud Boys, anti...
I think that I'd like to call attention as a historian to the difference of opinion on interpretive questions and difference of opinion on factual questions. And, I'm a good old New England Patriots fan, and I'd like to make the case that Tom Brady's the greatest quarterback in NFL history. But that's an opinion, and people can disagree with that, and they've got other options that I think are realistic and sensible and plausible. But I also believe that Brady and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers won the Super Bowl against Kansas City in the most recent Super Bowl in January, and that's a fact. And there are people that don't even believe that. They believe there's a woman referee that made calls that cost Kansas City the game, blah, 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 that it was rigged. I think it's time to put away childish things in that regard. But the difference between a difference of opinion on fact and a difference of opinion on interpretation is something I'd like to hold in people's minds.
Gentlemen, we need to take a short break. When we return, we'll continue continue this conspiracy talk. There's two others that I would like to touch on, and one is the idea that the revolution was born of conspiracy because Britain wanted to enslave the American people. And the other is that the American government wants to take away your guns. So we'll come back to those in just a moment. We're going to take a short break. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour with our returning champion, Dr. Joseph Ellis. We're talking about conspiracy theories today, and we will get on to the issue of guns in America. But just to wrap up, we went through a few. Then you brought up Brady, and then I thought, okay, now we have football gate. That whole thing about the football. There's one. Of course, there are Holocaust deniers in every direction. Did Yoko Ono break up the Beatles? We've got to face that. Is Elvis still alive in Guatemala or Mexico or possibly Reno? All of these. I mean, Americans love this stuff, Joe.
Yeah, they do. We do. I mean, and I think it is a tendency in societies in which governments are based on the democratic foundations that are popular opinion, and the freedom to think for yourself also means that freedom to develop ideas that are your own that don't seem to be sensible. We should also tell our listeners, though, that the United States is not the only place where conspiracy theories function. I mean, Hitler rose on the basis of a conspiracy theory that a knife in the back by its own leaders during World War I, and they could have won the war, and they didn't, and that was a lie. But the point being that it's not uniquely American.
We talked at the break, I brought up this conspiracy theory of Americans fearful that the government wanted to take away their firearms. And Joe, we talked a week or two ago about having a conversation about Jefferson and guns and the Second Amendment. And I will say that it's one of the more volatile subjects that we talk about, that and enslavement of people. We get a lot of very opinionated mail on both of those subjects, but it's what Jefferson called the gunmen. And he refers to them a lot, and he refers to gun ownership a lot.
I don't ever remember him owning a gun.
He does own guns. There's one gun story.
There's many, many references to that.
My favorite is when he was a young man and his father sent him out hunting, and he takes this gun, and Jefferson's clearly not going to be a hunter, and he's supposed to get a wild turkey, so he eventually can't do it, so he gets a domestic turkey and ties it to a tree and shoots it with his rifle and carries it home as his trophy. So that's not a very good start.
You're underlining a point. He wasn't a hunter. I mean, he didn't, Jefferson never walked behind a plow, and as far as I can tell, he never went deer hunting.
There's a great entry in his letters from October of 1803 where he had been at the inn, the Orange Courthouse Inn, and he writes a letter saying, quote, "I left at your house the morning after I lodged there a pistol in a locked case, which no doubt was found in your bar after my departure," and he asks for its return. He had a pair of Turkish pistols. He had a shotgun. He was a gunman.
David, can I set this up for our conversation? I think there are three lines of narrative here. One is guns and the Second Amendment with respect to an American militia system. That's number one. Number two is guns as used for home defense, for personal safety, to avoid home invasion, for self-protection. And number three, guns as a tool in the human right to revolution, the idea that the government must never have a monopoly on the uses of force. So these three different elements, guns for militia, for national defense, guns for personal safety and defense, and then guns for the right to revolution, they all swirl around a little in this conversation. And Jefferson, of all the founding fathers, is the one most likely to make the argument that guns have a role in revolution.
But he also thought that they should be regulated. There's a famous quote from October of 1824 when he's talking about the University of Virginia and the rules being written. And the rule reads, quote, "No student shall, within the precincts of the university, introduce, keep, or use any spirituous liquors, keep or use weapons or arms of any kind."
Yeah, there was a riot at the University of Virginia soon after it was founded that that forced him to have a meeting, and that might have been the occasion when he made those remarks. He was really crestfallen at the fact that people didn't internalize, in what he called self-government way, the rules of the school, and they sort of rioted. But can I comment on the Second Amendment? I've written about this in a couple of books, and I don't deny the fact that contemporary Americans who purchase weapons believe they have Second Amendment rights. And they do have the rights that were granted to them. They're not completely unlimited rights under the Supreme Court decision written by Anthony Scalia called D.C. versus Heller in 2011. And I don't deny that that was the decision made in that Supreme Court case. But if you go back to the original meaning and values of the Second Amendment, written by Jefferson's closest colleague, James Madison, the primary purpose of the Second Amendment was to assure that national defense would be in the hands of state militia rather than a federal or now we'd say United States Army. That in the ratification process, states could make recommended amendments. They couldn't make amendments that were assured to go into effect, but they could make recommended amendments. And when Madison wrote what we call the Bill of Rights, they didn't call it that then, but that's what he had in front of him. There were about 125 of those proposed amendments. 7 states had recommended that the defense of the United States not be in the hands of a federal and what they would call a standing army. They were terrified of standing armies, and Jefferson was too. And so the function of the Second Amendment was to assure that that did not happen. The full meaning of the Second Amendment was given legislative life in 1791 after the amendment was ratified. The law said that all adult males purchase a musket and what they called an outfit, that is to be ready to serve in the state militia. There's also been a digital study of the 7 most prominent founders and the use of the term bear arms, the right to bear arms. The term bear arms in all 158 cases referred to service in the military. And in some sense, then, the true meaning of the Second Amendment, as it was intended by Madison and the people at the time, was that you have an obligation to serve and own a gun in that capacity, not that you have a right to carry a weapon at all times and anywhere you want to. Nevertheless, Scalia's decision is law, and I don't contest that.
Why do you think it's so important to so many Americans to preserve this right to be able to carry arms wherever they want, whenever they want?
Well, I don't know whether it's so many Americans. In the Dakotas, it might be a majority opinion, but that after every massacre, I'm thinking back to the one at Sandy Hook especially, polls suggest that somewhere between 75 and 80% of the American public, to include a majority of Republicans and even a significant minority of members of the National Rifle Association, are in favor of expanded background checks and a limitation on military-style automatic weapons. The people who are in the Senate have been able to block that. So even though something like 80, in one case, 89% of the people are in favor of those kind of regulations, it cannot pass the Congress. I'm in favor of whenever there's a discussion of this on national television, and I think we're going to see one fairly soon as Biden brings this up, I would like whoever's talking, whether it's a Republican or Democrat, beneath them, instead of today's weather or the latest findings from the basketball tournaments, show us how much money that person receives from interested parties, and in this case, the NRA or people opposed to the NRA. Because I think money is controlling this conversation. And it's not that really the NRA so much as the gun makers themselves that are the beneficiaries here. Let me just also, if you look at America, we own 40% of all the guns in the world. We have the highest homicide rate of any advanced democracy in the world. And most of the people in Europe and Australia and New Zealand and Canada look at us and think we're out of our minds. So it seems to me that some form of regulation is absolutely necessary. And even the Heller decision leaves the door slightly ajar. No rights, not even the right of free speech is totally unlimited. You don't have the right to shout fire in a crowded room. And I think we need a debate on this in which people who have interests that are controlled by money need to be outed in the way that I described.
Let me back up what you just said with a couple of statistics, Joe. U.S. civilians own 393 million firearms. That represents 35 to 42% of all the households in the country have at least one gun. The United States has the highest estimated number of guns per capita at 120.5 guns for every 100 people. But back to my previous question, there are Americans who are so proud of gun ownership. There are members of Congress who want to carry guns onto the floor of the House. And they hold guns in photos of themselves on Facebook posts and are so proud of this American right. So we get back to that conspiracy theory of somebody that they have to protect themselves against.
Mm-hmm. And somebody's going to come and the federal government's going to come and take away your guns. And I don't think anybody in the Biden administration is talking about doing that. Unless you own, 7 AR-15s, and why do you own them? What do you use them for? I mean, apart from brand, I got into a debate in Atlanta when I was on the road for one of a book, because I have a chapter in a book called American Dialogue that talks about the Second Amendment. And a man came up to the microphone and opened his coat up and showed me that he was carrying, and the people came running down because you weren't supposed to have a weapon inside that auditorium. And I said, leave him alone. He's not going to do any damage. And I said, can I frame this in a way that allows us to have a dialogue? I'm a believer in argument. And he said, sure. So I said, I agree that you have a right to own and carry a weapon. And you agree that I have a right not to be shot. My rights end where yours begin and yours end where mine begin. Can we begin there? He said, no. My rights are unlimited. And once I admit that there are any constraints, it will be a slippery slope to have me completely disarmed. And that's where we're at.
Clay, I'd really like to hear you answer that same question, if you would.
Well, I have a little way of maybe framing this argument. And what I'm gonna say is that we're in a nearly impossible situation here. So I agree with Joe about the historic roots of the Second Amendment. So let's say that we could have unanimity amongst all historians without any doubt that the Second Amendment's purpose was a militia, not individual ownership and use of firearms, that the whole point of it was to prevent a standing army and to encourage a militia, and in which you don't possess arms, you bear arms.
Yes, and that the federal courts, including the Supreme Court, in all decisions until 2011, took that position. In order to reverse that, you had to overturn 2 centuries of legal precedent, and that's what Scalia did.
So my point is that let's say that 100% of American historians would agree on this. The people who are the ones you're talking about, David, would say, that ain't true. That's fake news. If you could then get God to certify that that's the truth, they would say, that may be, but I don't care. I still get my right to keep and bear arms. It doesn't matter what the historians think. It doesn't even matter what the founding fathers think. It only matters that I have a right to a gun. All right, so then let's say you could get them to agree, we could get the country to agree that some sort of gun regulation, whether it's preventing bump stocks or banishing automatic or semi-automatic rifles and so on, if you could get the country to agree to do this, you still have hundreds of millions of guns out there, number one, and confiscating them is going to be an extremely complicated and problematic matter. And secondly, the black market for guns is going to flourish, that it would be very, very, very difficult to get at the black market, even if you could build a national consensus to do something about this. So people discredit the history, and they will look at someone like Joe Ellis and say, yeah, he's full of beans, and I don't care what he says. That's not what the Second Amendment means. And if you could convince them that that's what the Second Amendment means, they're going to say, I don't care what the Founding Fathers had in mind. Here's the truth. And then if you could convince them that moderate gun regulation is a good idea, they would say, I don't care what you say. I'm going to get all the guns I want, and you're going to take my gun out of my cold, dead hands. So how do we get anywhere from that depth, David, of a passionate, obsessive belief that guns are the center of being a free human being?
Well, that was really the question I wanted to get you to answer. It leaves me in sort of a depressed state. No matter what we do, we're going to be faced with this dilemma, and there's really no way out of it.
Well, New Zealand is not as big as the United States by any stretch, and it doesn't have a Second Amendment. But they are, as was Australia too. They were a land where the frontier was a big part of their historical experience, and guns were a part of their life. And they had a population that owned guns that was comparable to the United States, not quite, but the same. And there was a massacre there, and I think 13 people died. Well, we have that like every other week now. But after that massacre, there was a groundswell of popular opinion. They got rid of all automatic weapons. You had to turn it in. It was a matter of honor to turn it in. I don't know whether they were reimbursed for it or not, but it was just an overwhelming democratic response by the population of New Zealand to this. And even the former gun owners are happy with it, saying, I might be surrendering something that I believe is mine, but I recognize that I'm part of a collective that has responsibilities, and I have responsibilities in that capacity. And it's interesting that you don't get anything like that reaction within most of the most passionate gun owners in the United States.
Well, that's what we began talking about here today, that America has a mythology where sort of Lee Greenwood's Americans, don't tread on me, at least I know I'm free, live free or die. And wrapped up at the very center of this national understanding of itself, this narrative, this mythology, is gun rights, gun ownership. And we are susceptible to this paranoia. It's Richard Hofstadter, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, that this is one of the places where you can touch off paranoia more quickly than in almost any other arena. And if you asked the great majority of people who live in red America, what would you go into the streets and maybe burn something down over? I can promise you that they would say, not so much the First Amendment, not so much the Fifth Amendment, not so much the Sixth Amendment, but if you try to take my guns away, I will see you at high noon on Main Street. I don't think that's an exaggeration. I think this is so deeply woven into the American psyche, not in all Americans, but in a very, very large and loud percentage of them, that getting from here to there is an impossibility.
Gentlemen, I'm sorry to have to interrupt the two of you, but we do need to take a short break from this discussion about the gunmen, Jefferson and guns. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We hear Joe Ellis's dog's getting involved in the conversation
I'm sorry,
somewhere
we get my
in
doodle.
It's
rural
great.
Vermont.
It's great to hear they're happy and healthy.
Well, it's not clear that they're happy, but they're certainly alive. So, Joe, I was just saying that, we started off talking about Hostetler's view that America is especially paranoid and given to conspiracy theories. We made a number of examples. We've agreed that this is something that's deeply embedded into the American psyche, or part of the psyche of some Americans. So what do you say to all of that? How do we get there?
I hear you on this, and because you live in the Midwest and I live in New England, our perspectives probably aren't identical, but just as a historian here, that I think that this level of commitment to an unburdened and unregulated right to own weapons of any sort is a reasonably recent phenomena. It's since the late 1960s. When the NRA was founded in the early 60s, it was an organization for gun safety, and they opposed the ownership of automatic weapons. And in 1964, a poll showed that 67% of the people in the United States didn't even think that you should own a handgun. And there's been a very orchestrated campaign by the anti-government people on the right to change that narrative. And they've succeeded. And the NRA has flourished, although now it seems to me the NRA is in deep trouble and is bankrupt and filled with corruption. And it might be possible at this moment to have a serious debate and conversation among us, at least at the national level, that leads to some kind of modest reform.
Well, I do agree that historically, the NRA in 1966 had positions that would now be regarded as those of Bernie Sanders or Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
And it has drifted so far to the right.
There was the Chief Justice in the early 70s, Warren Berger, I think, was on NPR television, and this came up, and he said, the American people are being given a fraud, and it's the biggest fraud I have ever seen. When the first glimmer of this unlimited rights to own and carry a gun were put forward, he says, I've never seen anything like it, but it's just an unbelievable. The word he used was fraud, and of course, now that fraud is a deeply felt, passionate sense of right, just as you described. But it's not remember, the most famous gunfight in American history is the gunfight at the OK Corral. And it was based on the fact that the Earp brothers insisted that the Clancy gang had to turn in their guns. Even on the frontier where, gun ownership was, that there were regulations when you went into town. I do think we are a people that is predisposed to conspiracy theories and what as you say, Hofstadter calls the paranoid style in American politics. But I think that way of thinking is underneath this, and that we've got to get past that in order to have this conversation that we need to have.
My only point in all of this is that if you, Joe, were regarded as the greatest historian in human history and no one ever doubted a word that came out of your mouth,
and it would still make no difference.
It would make no difference.
We can never test that because I'm certainly not that creature. And when you said earlier in the broadcast that 100% of American historians agree on this, 100% of American historians don't agree on anything. And I'm just calling for a serious dialogue. And if you're not prepared to have a dialogue, if you simply resist, then it seems to me that you're acknowledging that that you're beyond reason.
When I give talks on the Constitution of the United States, I will say, for example, that the word God or Jesus or providence or nature's God or creator does not exist in the Constitution of the United States. And people will stand up and say, you're wrong. And I'll say, all right, look, I defy you, using any search engine you want, to find any reference to God or religion in the Constitution of the United States, and they'll say you're wrong. And if I say, well, I can prove it, they'll say it doesn't matter. They all believed in God. They wanted a Christian nation. So if that's the level of argumentation, that historical evidence means nothing, that it has no validity when it comes up against people's personal mythologies or prejudices, then we're toast. That's the death of the humanities, Joe.
Well, we're halfway there, and American colleges are and here's where I'm going to side with some people on the conservative side. They're so politically correct you can't have a debate. I will say that it relates to Jefferson. I've been asked to go on several shows that were religious programs on the evangelical side to argue whether or not Jefferson was an evangelical Christian. And my posture is, if you pay me enough money, I will tell you how you can prove that Jefferson was an evangelical Christian. However, in the process of so doing, I've got to suppress 99% of the evidence, because Jefferson not only was not an evangelical Christian, he wasn't even a Christian. He was a deist. He thought Jesus was a very important, nice guy like Socrates. And then they'll say, I saw a Bible at Monticello that Jefferson wrote, and it's not going to tell you what you think you want to know. In certain contexts, political contexts, people's minds is made up, and they believe they've got, even whether they believe that God exists, he's on their side.
Well, we're in a time now of manic conspiracy theories. The election was stolen. The shooting in Las Vegas was actually done by aliens from satellites. That there was voter fraud in states which have certified, recertified, and audited, et cetera, et cetera. You know, we're in a period now where it's science fiction land, that these things are even beyond the pale of the usual level of American conspiracy theories, and they work. My point is that the standards of evidence, of logic, of evaluation, of testing ideas, of trying to figure out what critical thinking would bring to any given proposition, like Antifa handled the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, those things no longer matter for tens of millions of people. And their view is, I know what I know, and don't tell me what you're telling me, because I know you can't be a reliable person.
I think that one suggestion I've found myself making in certain audiences of late is, I'd like a serious discussion around the following proposal: that all graduates of high school, secondary school in the United States must pass the civics test currently required for all immigrants applying for American citizenship. Part of the reason that misinformation becomes credible is people don't have any kind of historical foundation about who the founders really were, and blah, 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 all the way through American history. And again, it's not a complete solution, but it's a step in the right direction.
We've talked about that before, and I think it's important we do what we said, Clay, and get President Jefferson to take that test, don't you?
Better Jefferson than me. I don't want to fail in front of our millions of listeners. I have a relative in Kansas who won't get a vaccine because this person says that the government is going to inject a chip into their body.
Yeah, I think that the pandemic puts pressure on a Jeffersonian mentality because Jefferson really believed, and this is the reason why Hamilton called him a utopian, that ordinary Americans will internalize a sense of their responsibility to others and to the collective interest of the community. And that's what he called self-government, which was his ideal, towards which we should all be aspiring. And I think that the pandemic and its reaction to it makes it clear that that's both Washington and Hamilton said that Jefferson was naive in this regard. And the fact that so many people didn't want to wear masks, the masks, protect other people, not you, but as much as other people. And it's a real test of the Jeffersonian ideal, and a significant portion of the American populace failed the test.
I'm going to suggest that that's a fairly optimistic viewpoint, Joe, and say that I think that's a good place for us to bring this conversation to a close. And thanks so much for taking time to talk with Clay and I today.
Hey, it's been my pleasure. My dogs say thank you too.
The dogs need a treat.
Clay, it's always good to hear your voice, man.
Yours too. We appreciate your wisdom. Thanks to Joe Ellis from his undisclosed location in the Green Mountains. His dogs are giving away the location if anybody has the proper listening device. Thanks, Joe.
We'll talk again soon. Bye-bye. Always great to talk to Joe, and we could go on and on and on. But, sir, it is now time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
Thank you, David. Look, my friends, at some point we are going to have a rational national conversation about guns. I understand the passions that swirl around this subject. The Second Amendment has great weight. I know plenty of people who believe the Second Amendment is the most important passage in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And I'm pretty sure that thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of individuals would take to the streets with firearms if the U.S. Congress passed serious gun restriction legislation. In fact, the most likely way to touch off a real civil war would be to require all guns in the United States to be registered. I get it. This is not like raising the drinking age or raising the speed limit on the nation's highways. If you did those things, plenty of people would squawk, and some would protest in the streets, but they would not carry their AR-15s into that arena. Guns, and what guns can do, are very deeply embedded into some parts of the American psyche. So here are just a few propositions that I think are rational. I know others may disagree, and I'll get hate mail over this, but I'm not afraid to tell the truth as I know it, to read the Bill of Rights as I understand it, and to make policy recommendations that I believe would be good for America. Number one, the Founding Fathers had in mind a community militia system. They were uniformly concerned about the implications of a standing army in a republic. They knew their history well. They believed that a permanent military establishment is dangerous. When Jefferson spoke of, quote, a militia only till actual invasion, he was indicating his belief that a permanent army is expensive, that it is a war machine that will want to see action, and that throughout history, standing armies often turn their aggressions on their own people. The wording of the Second Amendment clearly intends to address the idea of our national defense system, not a simple and untethered grant of gun rights to individuals. Number two, when the Second Amendment was ratified on December 15, 1791, a high-tech weapon was a musket that took 20 to 45 seconds to reload. None of the Founding Fathers could ever have imagined a weapon that would shoot scores of bullets in a minute. If the shooters at Columbine High School in Colorado or Sandy Hook Elementary in Connecticut had been using muskets and 18th century pistols, they would have gotten off no more than 1 or 2 shots before they were wrestled to the ground and disarmed. The astounding gun technologies of our time represent a difference not just in degree, but in kind, from the weapons of our bewigged founders, who bled people with sore throats and lit their homes with candles. And these astounding new weapons require, therefore, a rethinking about the Second Amendment. Number three, it is impossible to imagine that any of the founders, including that most radical of them, Thomas Jefferson, could endorse our current reading of the Second Amendment. None of them, not George Washington, not Patrick Henry, not Daniel Shays of Shays' Rebellion, would approve of the mayhem that our permissive interpretation of the Second Amendment has enabled. They would all be horrified. They would clarify and revise the Second Amendment immediately. None of the founders loved liberty in a way that licensed individuals to carry around that much destructive power without proper training and reasonable regulation. Number four, if people from Jupiter or Mars visited the Earth today, they would find much to ponder. I feel certain they would say, how is it that every modern nation carefully regulates the sale, distribution, and use of firearms, but the United States alone is unwilling to do something about countless annual gun shootings, including, with ever greater frequency, mass shootings? They would ask how a nation that regards itself as civilized does not address this problem in a rational manner, in a practical manner. And they would ask, how is it that the automobile is registered, drivers licensed, insurance required, speed limits enforced, dangerous vehicles outlawed, but firearms are virtually untouched by restriction or regulation in the United States? 5. Any rational person looking at the 49th parallel, the boundary with Canada, will see what we need to do. Canada has reasonable gun restrictions. Hunters can hunt. People can protect their homes from criminal invasion. Canada has about 1,300 gun deaths per year. The United States more than 30,000. Canada has had 15 mass shootings since the 1880s. The United States now no less than 3 per year. And yet the Canadians are not less free than we are. They do not yearn for greater access to guns. They shake their heads that a seemingly civilized, also English-derived and English-speaking people across an imaginary line are willing to put up with so much gun violence. England is not less free than the U.S. Germany is not less free. France is not less free. Japan is not less free. And don't even get me started on quality of life. Number 6. I am not in favor of confiscating hunting rifles or shotguns or low-volume pistols. I think any mentally sane non-felon who wants a few guns should be permitted to have them. I personally would like to see all guns registered, as all cars are registered, but this is not one of my primary concerns. I would like to see bump stocks outlawed, certain types of ammunition outlawed, automatic rifles outlawed, large magazines outlawed, and I would like to see universal, rigorous federal background checks for every firearm purchased in the United States, with very stiff penalties for violation of the law. I would like to see all trade show loopholes closed. 7. For me, it is very simple. Firearms that can only be understood as weapons of war should be banned. I don't think anyone can explain why an individual in the United States needs a military-style weapon. 8. The argument that gun regulation is a slippery slope leading to a police state or Hitler's Germany is insane. The NRA in 1966 was thoughtful about the proliferation of firearms. The policies from that era, if quoted out of context by gun obsessives today, would be regarded as the stuff of Bernie Sanders, not the NRA as it used to be recognized. Number 9. I believe we must pass legislation permitting gun victims to sue firearms companies, just as we let individuals file lawsuits against doctors, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, car manufacturers, and tobacco manufacturers. If the arms merchants were held responsible for the mayhem they enable, they would immediately get serious and help us develop moderate gun legislation that would protect innocent hunters and sportsmen, but keep guns out of the hands of those who are angry, unstable, or mentally ill. And finally, number 10. I know that about 75% of the American people agree with these suggestions and reforms. In a true democracy, their views would be taken seriously and provisions of it enacted into law, subject, of course, to judicial review. I repeat, in despair and sorrow, at some point we are going to have a rational national conversation about gun violence in America. Now is that time. I'm not afraid of it. Are you? I'm Clay Jenkinson. Please join us next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.